The town of Myrtle Ridge had always been quiet in the way that only dying places can be quiet. Nestled in a forgotten hollow of the Appalachian Mountains, it was the kind of town where the grocery store closed at 6, where the single traffic light blinked yellow after dark, and where everybody knew everybody's business before the business even happened. In 1987, the population had dwindled to just under 800 souls, most of them too old or too poor to leave. The coal mines had closed 15 years prior, and the town had been slowly bleeding out ever since, its young people fleeing to Charleston or Pittsburgh or anywhere that offered more than memories and mountain fog. Sheriff Marcus Delaine had served Myrtle Ridge for 23 years, and in all that time, the most serious crime he'd investigated was Billy Harmon's theft of copper wire from the abandoned Elkhorn mine. He kept a bottle of bourbon in his desk drawer, not because he was a drinking man, but because he'd seen the sheriffs in movies keep one, and he figured the gesture was expected. The bottle had been there for 8 years, its seal unbroken. Everything changed on October 14, 1987, when Eleanor Vance's body was found in her kitchen. Marcus remembered every detail of that morning with the crystalline clarity that trauma sometimes provides. The call had come in at 7:42 a.m. from Doris Patterson, Eleanor's neighbor, who had gone over to borrow sugar and found the back door standing open. Doris was 74 years old and had seen her share of death in her lifetime, but her voice on the phone had been reduced to something childlike and trembling. Case file, Mr. 1987-001. Victim, Eleanor May Vance, age 68. Date of discovery, October 14, 1987, 7:42 a.m. Location, 447 Hollow Creek Road, Myrtle Ridge, West Virginia. Initial responding officer, Sheriff Marcus Delaine. Condition of body, deceased, seated at kitchen table. Severe mutilation noted. Both ears removed surgically. No signs of struggle. Victim's expression suggests peaceful death prior to mutilation. Eleanor Vance had been sitting at her kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for something. Her eyes were closed, her face serene, almost peaceful. But where her ears should have been, there were only ragged wounds, the flesh carved away with what the county coroner would later describe as surgical precision. The wounds had been cleaned. There was no blood on Eleanor's face, no blood on her nightgown, no blood anywhere except for 2 small pools that had collected beneath her chair. Someone had taken the time to wash her after the mutilation. The strangest thing, Marcus noted, was the cup of tea on the table. It was still warm. He spent the next 6 hours going through Eleanor's house with Deputy Roy Mackin, a heavy-set man in his 30s who had never dealt with anything more gruesome than roadkill. Roy vomited twice in the backyard before managing to compose himself enough to help with the investigation. They found nothing out of place. No signs of forced entry. No footprints in the soft earth around the house. No murder weapon. Nothing stolen as far as they could tell. The interviews began that afternoon. Marcus sat with Doris Patterson in her parlor, the old woman clutching a cup of coffee she never drank, her hands shaking so badly that the liquid threatened to spill over the rim with every tremor. Witness statement, Doris Patterson. I've known Eleanor for 40 years, Sheriff. 40 years. We had coffee together every Sunday after church. She was the kindest woman you'd ever meet. Never had a harsh word for anyone, not even when her husband passed and she had to sell half her land to pay the medical bills. She didn't deserve this. Nobody deserves this. When Marcus asked if Eleanor had mentioned anything unusual in the days before her death, Doris's face changed. The fear that had been lurking beneath her grief suddenly surfaced, and she set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. She called me 3 nights ago. Late, maybe 11 o'clock. Woke me right up. She sounded scared, Marcus. I'd never heard Eleanor scared before, not even when the tornado came through in '79. She said she'd been hearing her name. Said someone was whispering it from inside her walls. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. He asked Doris to elaborate. She said it started 3 days before she called me. She'd be sitting in her living room, reading or doing her crossword, and she'd hear it. Just her name. Eleanor. Like someone was standing right behind her and whispering it into her ear. But when she turned around, there was never anyone there. She checked the whole house, Sheriff. Every closet, every room. She even went up into the attic with a flashlight, and you know how bad her knees were. She was terrified. Said the voice sounded like it was coming from inside the walls themselves. Marcus asked if Eleanor had seen anything. A shadow, a movement, anything at all. Doris shook her head slowly. That's the thing, Sheriff. She said she never saw anything. But she felt it. She said she could feel something watching her, feel it getting closer every day. She asked me if I thought she was losing her mind. I told her no, of course not. I told her it was probably just the house settling, or maybe an animal had gotten into the walls. I told her to call an exterminator. The old woman's voice broke. I should have listened. I should have gone over there and stayed with her. Maybe if I had, she'd still be alive. Marcus assured her that there was nothing she could have done, but even as he spoke the words, he wondered if they were true. He thanked her for her time and stepped out into the gray October afternoon, the mountains rising dark and silent around the town like the walls of a tomb. That night, he sat in his office and stared at the case file until the words blurred into meaninglessness. The coroner's preliminary report had come in an hour earlier. Eleanor Vance had died of heart failure, her body simply giving out. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of restraint, no indication that she had struggled or even been aware of the mutilation. The removal of her ears had occurred post-mortem, the coroner estimated, within minutes of her death. Someone had waited for her to die and then carved her ears away. Marcus opened his desk drawer and looked at the bottle of bourbon. For the first time in 8 years he considered breaking the seal. Instead he closed the drawer and reached for the phone. He needed to call the state police. This was beyond anything Myrtle Ridge could handle alone. But even as he lifted the receiver, a part of him knew that the state police wouldn't find anything. Whatever had killed Eleanor Vance, whatever had whispered her name from inside the walls and then taken her ears as some kind of terrible trophy, it wasn't something that could be caught with fingerprint kits and forensic analysis. It was something older than that. Something that had always been here, waiting in the hollows and the shadows of the mountains, patient as stone. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows of the sheriff's office, and Marcus could have sworn he heard something beneath the sound. A voice perhaps. A whisper. But when he listened more carefully, there was only silence. The state police sent Detective Arnold Kepler, a thin man with prematurely gray hair and eyes that seemed to have seen too much. He arrived in Myrtle Ridge on October 16 and immediately set about examining the crime scene with a thoroughness that Marcus found both impressive and futile. Kepler dusted for fingerprints, collected hair and fiber samples, photographed every inch of Eleanor Vance's kitchen, and interviewed nearly a dozen residents of Hollow Creek Road. He found nothing. "It's like she just died," Kepler said on the evening of his third day in town, sitting across from Marcus in the dim light of Rosie's diner. Died of natural causes, and then someone came in and took her ears without leaving a single trace. "I've been doing this for 15 years, Sheriff, and I've never seen anything like it. No point of entry, no point of exit. No physical evidence whatsoever. It's as if the killer was a ghost." Marcus told him about the whispers. About what Eleanor had told Doris Patterson in the days before her death. Kepler listened with the polite skepticism of a man who dealt in facts and evidence, and when Marcus finished, the detective nodded slowly. Auditory hallucinations. Not uncommon in the elderly, especially those living alone. The brain starts to play tricks. She might have been in the early stages of dementia without anyone realizing it. The fear and stress could have triggered the heart failure. "And the years?" Marcus asked. Kepler's expression darkened. "That's where it gets complicated. Trophy taking is usually associated with serial offenders. Organized killers who take souvenirs from their victims. But those killers leave evidence. They make mistakes. Whoever did this was either incredibly lucky or incredibly skilled. Or both. The second victim was found 5 days later. Case file, Mr. 1987-002. Victim, Harold Eugene Sims, age 71. Date of discovery, October 21, 1987, 6:15 a.m. Location, 112 Mountain View Lane, Myrtle Ridge, West Virginia. Discovered by mail carrier Thomas Webb. Condition of body, deceased, found in bed. Bilateral ear removal consistent with first victim. No signs of struggle. Preliminary cause of death, cardiac arrest. Harold Sims had been a quiet man, a retired schoolteacher who spent his days tending to his vegetable garden and reading history books from the county library. His wife had passed away 3 years earlier, and since then he had lived alone in the small house they had shared for 4 decades. He was known for his gentle demeanor and his encyclopedic knowledge of the Civil War, and no one in Myrtle Ridge could imagine why anyone would want to harm him. Thomas Webb, the mail carrier, had found him because he noticed 3 days of mail piling up in Harold's mailbox. When knocking on the door produced no response, Thomas had looked through the bedroom window and seen Harold lying in bed, motionless, with dark stains on his pillow where his ears should have been. The investigation revealed a pattern identical to the first killing. No forced entry, no physical evidence, no witnesses. The coroner determined that Harold had died of cardiac arrest, likely induced by extreme fear, and that his ears had been removed within minutes of his death. The wounds had been cleaned with the same meticulous care. But it was Harold's neighbor Ruth Carney who provided the detail that made Marcus's blood run cold. Witness statement, Ruth Carney. He came to see me 4 days ago. Maybe 5. He was agitated, which wasn't like Harold at all. You know how calm he always was, Sheriff. Nothing ever rattled that man. But that day he was pale as a sheet and his hands were shaking. He asked me if I'd heard anything strange lately. Any voices, he said. Any whispering. I told him no, I hadn't heard anything like that. And he got this look on his face, Sheriff. This look of pure relief, like I'd just told him he wasn't dying. He said he'd been hearing his name. Said someone was whispering it from inside the empty rooms of his house. He thought he was losing his mind. I told him it was probably just the wind, or maybe his hearing aid acting up. He said he'd taken his hearing aid out and he could still hear it. Said the voice was getting closer. Said he could feel something standing behind him sometimes, when he was alone in a room. But when he turned around there was never anything there. Marcus asked if Harold had mentioned anything else. Any other details about the voice or the presence he felt. Ruth's face crumpled. He said it only spoke his name. Over and over again. Harold, Harold, Harold. Like it was trying to get his attention. Like it wanted him to know it was there. Detective Kepler left Myrtle Ridge on October 23, promising to return if any new evidence emerged. He looked tired as he shook Marcus's hand, and there was something in his eyes that might have been relief. A relief at escaping this quiet town in its lonely valley where impossible things seemed to be happening. The fear spread through Myrtle Ridge like a contagion. People who had lived alone for years suddenly found reasons to stay with family. Doors that had been left unlocked for decades were now bolted shut. The hardware store sold out of deadbolts and window locks. The town's single bar, a dingy establishment called the Hollow, was packed every night with people who couldn't bear to be alone in their homes. And the whispers continued. Margaret Hollis reported hearing her name on October 24. She was 62 years old, a retired nurse, and she lived alone in a small cottage on the outskirts of town. She came to the sheriff's office in person, her face drawn and her eyes darting nervously to every shadow. It started last night, she said. I was in the kitchen making dinner and I heard someone say my name. Just Margaret. Clear as day. But when I looked around there was no one there. I checked the whole house, Sheriff. Every room, every closet. Nothing. Marcus asked her to stay with someone. Family, friends, anyone. He offered to have Deputy Mackin drive by her house every hour through the night. He did everything he could think of to protect her. It wasn't enough. Case file. Mr. 1987-003. Victim. Margaret Ann Hollis, age 62. Date of discovery. October 27, 1987, 9:30 a.m. Location. 78 Pine Street, Myrtle Ridge, West Virginia. Discovered by Sister Evelyn Hollis Burke. Condition of body. Deceased, found in living room armchair. Bilateral ear removal. No signs of struggle. Cause of death. Massive coronary event. Note, victim had been staying with Sister since October 25. Sister reports victim returned home alone on October 26 to retrieve medication. Did not return. Sister found body the following morning. Margaret had gone home for 15 minutes. 15 minutes alone, and whatever was hunting the people of Myrtle Ridge had found her. Marcus stood in Margaret's living room and stared at her body in the armchair, her hands folded in her lap, her face peaceful, her ears carved away with that same terrible precision. The medication she had come to retrieve, a bottle of blood pressure pills, sat on the end table beside her, unopened. She had never even reached for it. The fear in Myrtle Ridge transformed into something closer to panic. Sunday services at the Baptist church were standing room only. People who hadn't spoken to each other in years huddled together in living rooms, afraid to be alone. The town's elderly population, those who lived by themselves and had no family nearby, were particularly terrified. They were the targets the pattern made clear. Alone. Vulnerable. And marked by the whispers. Marcus began compiling everything he knew about the victims. He covered an entire wall of his office with photographs, maps, notes, and timelines, searching desperately for some connection, some pattern that might help him understand what was happening. Eleanor Vance, Harold Sims, and Margaret Hollis had all lived in Myrtle Ridge their entire lives. They had all been widowed, all lived alone, all reported hearing their names whispered from empty spaces before their deaths. But there was something else. Something that had been nagging at Marcus since the second murder, a detail so small and seemingly insignificant that he had almost overlooked it entirely. All three victims had ears. The thought seemed absurd when he first had it. Of course they had ears. Everyone had ears. But as he dug deeper into their backgrounds, a more specific pattern emerged. All three victims had been known for their hearing. Eleanor Vance had been the town's piano teacher for 40 years, her acute ear for music legendary among her former students. Harold Sims had been a birdwatcher, able to identify dozens of species by their calls alone. Margaret Hollis had worked in the newborn ward of the county hospital, priding herself on her ability to distinguish one crying baby from another in a room full of infants. They were listeners. People who heard things that others missed. Marcus thought about the old stories. The Appalachian folklore that his grandmother had whispered to him as a child, tales of things that lived in the mountains, creatures that predated the settlers, that had been here when the world was young and wild. He had dismissed those stories as nonsense, the superstitions of an uneducated past. But now, in the quiet of his office with 3 corpses and no answers, he found himself remembering. His grandmother had told him about the hollow men. Beings that existed in the spaces between, in the corners of empty rooms and the darkness beneath beds. They had no form, she said, no substance that the eye could perceive. But they were always there, always watching, always waiting. And sometimes when they grew hungry they would whisper. They call to the ones who can hear them, his grandmother had said, her voice low and solemn. The ones with the gift of listening. And when the listener finally answers, when they acknowledge the whisper, that's when the hollow man becomes real. That's when it can touch them. Marcus had asked her what happened then. His grandmother had looked at him with eyes that seemed suddenly very old. It takes their ears, child. So they can never hear anything else again. So the last thing they ever hear is their own name, spoken by something that should not exist. The 4th victim was found on October 31st, Halloween. Case file, Mr. 1987-004. Victim, Walter James Brennan, age 74. Date of discovery, October 31st, 1987, 11:45 p.m. Location, 234 Oak Street, Myrtle Ridge, West Virginia. Discovered by Deputy Roy Mackin, Routine Patrol. Condition of body, deceased, found on front porch. Bilateral ear removal. Subject appears to have been fleeing the residence at time of death. Cause of death, heart failure. Note: subject was known in community as having exceptional hearing despite advanced age. Former telephone switchboard operator. Walter Brennan had almost made it. He had run from whatever was pursuing him, had made it out of his house and onto his front porch, had been perhaps 3 steps from the street when his heart had finally given out. Deputy Mackin found him lying face down on the wooden boards, his hand outstretched toward the sidewalk, his ears removed with the same surgical precision as the others. But Walter's case was different in one crucial way. He had left something behind. Marcus found it on Walter's kitchen table. A tape recorder, the old reel-to-reel kind that had been popular in the 60s. It was still running when they found it, the tape turning slowly in the silence of the empty house. Marcus rewound it with trembling hands and pressed play. At first there was nothing but the ambient sounds of the house. The tick of a clock. The hum of the refrigerator. The creak of old timbers settling. Walter's breathing, steady but rapid, the sound of a man who was afraid but trying to control his fear. And then the whisper. Walter. Marcus felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The voice on the tape was unlike anything he had ever heard. It was soft, almost gentle, but there was something wrong with it, something that the recording captured but that human language couldn't quite describe. It sounded like a voice coming from very far away and very close at the same time. It sounded like it was coming from inside the tape recorder itself. On the recording, Walter's breathing quickened. "Don't answer it," the old man muttered to himself. "Don't answer. Don't acknowledge. It can't hurt you if you don't acknowledge. Walter." The whisper was closer now. More insistent. Walter's breathing became ragged, panicked. Marcus could hear him moving around the kitchen, could hear the scrape of chairs being pushed aside, the rattle of drawers being opened. Walter. And then Walter screamed. It was a sound of pure terror, the kind of scream that comes from a place beyond rational fear. Marcus could hear him running, could hear the crash of the front door being thrown open, and then the recording dissolved into static and silence. Marcus played the tape 3 more times. Each time he listened more carefully to the whisper, trying to understand what made it so deeply wrong. It wasn't just that the voice was inhuman, though it clearly was. It was something about the quality of the sound itself. It didn't seem to follow the normal rules of acoustics. It didn't echo or fade or distort the way a voice should when recorded. It was just there, perfectly clear and perfectly wrong, as if it had been recorded directly onto the tape from somewhere outside of normal space. He made copies of the recording and sent them to Detective Kepler, to the state police crime lab, to anyone he thought might be able to analyze it. The responses came back within a week and they were all the same. The recording was authentic, unedited, and impossible. Audio engineers couldn't explain how the whisper had been produced. One expert noted that the sound wave patterns didn't match any known human vocalization. Another suggested that the recording might have been made with equipment that didn't exist. Marcus put the tape in his desk drawer, next to the unopened bottle of bourbon, and tried to figure out what to do next. The answer came from an unexpected source. Her name was Mary Catherine Oakes and she was 93 years old. She had been born in Myrtle Ridge in 1894, had lived through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and the slow death of the coal industry. She was the oldest person in town by a considerable margin, and she was one of the last people who still remembered the old ways. She came to the sheriff's office on November 3rd, moving slowly but steadily with the help of a carved wooden cane. Her eyes were clouded with cataracts, but there was a sharpness behind them that belied her age. She sat down across from Marcus without being invited and fixed him with a stare that seemed to see right through him. "You've been looking for answers, Sheriff. I've come to give them to you. But I warn you, you won't like what you hear." Marcus asked her to continue. "My grandmother was Cherokee," Mary Catherine said. "She married a white man against her family's wishes and came to live in this valley. She taught me things that she'd learned from her own grandmother, things that were old when the first white settlers came to these mountains. She told me about the listener." Marcus felt something cold move through him. "The listener? That's what my grandmother called it. The Cherokee had a different name, one I was never allowed to speak aloud. It's a spirit, Sheriff. An old one. Older than these mountains, older than the trees. It lives in the spaces between things. In the silence. In the emptiness. And it feeds on hearing." She leaned forward, her ancient face grave. "It hunts those with the gift of listening. Those whose ears are sensitive, attuned to sounds that others miss. It whispers their names to draw their attention. And once they hear it, once they truly acknowledge its presence, it becomes real to them. It can touch them. It can take what it wants." Marcus asked why it was happening now. Why, after all these years, had the listener suddenly begun killing people? Mary Catherine's expression darkened. "Because the wards are failing, Sheriff. When the first settlers came to this valley, the Cherokee warned them. They told them about the spirit in the silence and they taught them how to protect themselves. There were rituals, ceremonies that had to be performed to keep the listener at bay. For 200 years, certain families in Myrtle Ridge maintained those protections. They passed the knowledge from generation to generation, never speaking of it publicly, never drawing attention to what they were doing." She paused, and Marcus saw something that might have been guilt in her eyes. "My family was one of them. I was the last of my line to learn the rituals. I performed them faithfully for 60 years, every solstice and every equinox, just as my mother had taught me. But I'm 93 years old, Sheriff. My hands shake too much to draw the symbols. My voice is too weak to speak the words. And there's no one left to teach. The knowledge is dying with me." Marcus asked if there was any way to stop the listener. Any way to protect the people of Myrtle Ridge. Mary Catherine shook her head slowly. "You can't stop it, Sheriff. You can't fight it or kill it or drive it away. It isn't a creature like you or me. It's a force as natural and as inevitable as gravity. All you can do is protect yourself from its attention." She reached into her bag and withdrew a small leather-bound book. Its pages were yellowed with age, covered in handwritten symbols and words in languages Marcus didn't recognize. "This is everything my family knew about the listener. The rituals, the wards, the protections. I'm giving it to you because there's no one else. You're the sheriff. It's your job to protect this town. Maybe you can find someone who can use this knowledge. Maybe you can rebuild the wards." She stood up, leaning heavily on her cane. "But I'll tell you one thing, Sheriff. One thing my grandmother told me that I've never forgotten." She met his eyes, and in her gaze, Marcus saw the accumulated wisdom of generations. "The listener only takes those who hear it. If you hear the whisper, if it speaks your name, you have 3 days. 3 days before it becomes solid enough to touch you. 3 days to flee or pray or make your peace with whatever God you believe in. But whatever you do, whatever happens, you must never, ever answer. The moment you respond to the whisper, the moment you acknowledge it in any way, it can materialize behind you. And then there's nothing that can save you." She left the office without another word, her cane tapping steadily on the wooden floor. Marcus sat alone in the fading afternoon light, the leather book in his hands, and felt the weight of impossible responsibility settling on his shoulders. That night he began to read. The book was a chronicle of horror. Generations of notes, written by dozens of hands, documenting encounters with the listener stretching back to the early 1800s. There were accounts of victims, of failed protections, of narrow escapes. There were detailed instructions for the ward ceremonies, complex rituals involving specific herbs, symbols drawn in ash and blood, and words in a language that seemed to shift and change when Marcus tried to read them aloud. And there were descriptions of the listener itself. It has no true form, one entry read, dated 1887. It exists in the absence of things. In the space behind you when you're alone. In the darkness of an empty room. It is invisible because it is nothing. It is only when it touches our world, only when a listener gives it purchase, that it becomes something that can be perceived. And even then, it can only be seen from behind. Face it and it vanishes. Turn away and it is there, close enough to touch, close enough to take what it wants. Marcus read through the night, his eyes burning, his mind reeling. By dawn he understood what he was dealing with. He understood why the victims had died with peaceful expressions on their faces. The listener didn't attack them from the front. It appeared behind them, in that blind spot that every human being possesses. And when it killed, when it stopped their hearts with pure, distilled terror, they never saw it coming. They only heard it. The last thing they heard was their own name. Marcus closed the book as the sun rose over the mountains and made a decision. He couldn't perform the ward rituals himself. The book made clear that the ceremonies required years of training and a specific kind of sensitivity that he didn't possess. But he could warn people. He could tell them what he knew, give them the tools to protect themselves. He called a town meeting for that evening. The meeting was held in the basement of the Baptist church, the largest space in Myrtle Ridge that could accommodate the crowd. Nearly every resident of the town was there, their faces drawn with fear and exhaustion, their eyes searching Marcus's face for some sign of hope. He told them everything. The pattern of the killings. The whispers that preceded each death. The testimony of Mary Catherine Oakes and the ancient book she had given him. He told them about the listener, about its nature and its methods, about the 3-day window between the first whisper and the final touch. He told them the one rule that might save their lives. Never answer the whisper. Never acknowledge it in any way. If you hear your name spoken in an empty room, do not respond. Do not turn around. Do not speak. Leave immediately and find other people. The listener cannot materialize if it is not acknowledged. It cannot touch you if you do not give it permission. The crowd listened in silence. Some wept. Some prayed. Some simply stared at Marcus with the blank expressions of people whose world had just fundamentally changed. One man in the back of the room raised his hand. It was George Carver, a farmer in his 60s who had lived in Myrtle Ridge his entire life. His voice was steady, but there was a tremor beneath it that betrayed his fear. What if we've already heard it, Sheriff? What if it's already spoken our names? Marcus met the man's eyes and saw the truth written there. George had heard the whisper. George was already marked. Then you have 3 days, Marcus said. 3 days to never be alone. Stay with family, with friends, with strangers if you have to. Keep people around you at all times. The listener cannot appear where there are witnesses. It exists in solitude, in isolation. Deny it that and it cannot touch you. But even as he spoke, Marcus knew it wasn't enough. People couldn't stay with others every moment of every day. Eventually, someone would step away for a moment. Eventually, someone would find themselves alone. And then the whisper would come. The 5th victim was found 2 days later. Case file, Mr. 1987-005. Victim, George Allen Carver, age 63. Date of discovery, November 7, 1987, 4:22 a.m. Location, Carver Family Farm, Route 7, Myrtle Ridge, WV. Discovered by wife Helen Carver. Condition of body, deceased, found in barn. Bilateral ear removal. Expression suggests extreme terror. Cause of death, cardiac arrest. Note, wife reports victim went to barn alone at approximately 4 a.m. to check on livestock. Was alone for no more than 20 minutes before being discovered. George Carver had done everything right. He had stayed with his wife, had kept family and neighbors around him at all times, had followed every precaution Marcus had outlined. But at 4 in the morning, when one of his cows began making distressed sounds, he had done what any farmer would do. He had gone to check on his animals. 20 minutes alone. That was all it took. Helen Carver described what she had found in a voice that seemed to come from very far away. George was lying in the hay, his body contorted, his face frozen in an expression of unimaginable horror. His eyes were wide open, staring at nothing. His mouth was stretched in a silent scream. And where his ears had been, there were only those terrible, precise wounds. But the thing that haunted Marcus, the detail that he would remember until the day he died, was what Helen said about the barn itself. It was silent, Sheriff. Completely silent. The cows weren't making any sound. The chickens weren't clucking. Even the wind had stopped. It was like the whole world was holding its breath. And when I walked in and saw George lying there, I could feel it. Something was in that barn with me. Something was standing right behind me. She had turned around, of course. She had turned around and seen nothing. But she knew, with a certainty that went beyond rational thought, that if she had waited one more second, she would have seen something. Something that existed only in the space behind her. Something that was waiting. The killings continued through November. The 6th victim was Clara Hutchins, 71, found in her bathroom. The 7th was Robert Pine, 68, found in his garage. The 8th was Dorothy Walsh, 79, found in her bedroom. Each one had been alone for only minutes. Each one had the same peaceful expression, the same precise wounds, the same evidence of a heart that had simply stopped. And then, on November 15th, Marcus heard his name. He was alone in his office, working late as he had been every night since the killings began. The building was silent, the streets of Myrtle Ridge empty. He was reading through Mary Catherine's book for perhaps the 100th time, searching for some detail he might have missed, some protection he hadn't yet tried. And then he heard it. Marcus. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. From the walls, from the floor, from the very air around him. It was soft, almost gentle, but there was something wrong with it. Something fundamentally inhuman. It didn't sound like a voice at all. It sounded like an absence of sound, a void in the shape of his name. Marcus didn't turn around. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his hands flat on his desk, his eyes fixed on the book in front of him. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had 3 days. 3 days to find a solution, to protect himself, to save what was left of his town. Marcus. The whisper was closer now. He could feel something behind him, a presence that pressed against the back of his neck like a cold breath. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to confront whatever was there, but he remembered Mary Catherine's warning. The moment you respond, the moment you acknowledge it in any way, it can materialize. He stood up slowly, keeping his eyes forward, and walked out of his office. He walked down the hallway through the front door and into the cold November night. He walked to his car, got in, and drove to his sister's house on the other side of town. He stayed there for 2 days, surrounded by family, never alone for a moment. He called Detective Kepler and told him everything. Kepler listened, and whether he believed or not, he sent additional officers to Myrtle Ridge. They patrolled the streets, checked on the elderly, organized a system of buddy watches to ensure no one was ever alone. On the 3rd day, Marcus returned to his office. He had a plan. It was desperate, almost certainly futile, but it was all he had. He had spent the past 2 days studying Mary Catherine's book, learning everything he could about the listener's nature. And he had discovered something that the previous generations had overlooked. The listener fed on ears because it was itself deaf to the physical world. It existed in silence, in the absence of sound. It whispered names because that was the only way it could make contact with the world of the living. And it took ears as trophies because they represented something it could never have, the ability to truly hear. Marcus had an idea. He set up speakers in his office, connected to a radio tuned to pure static. He cranked the volume as high as it would go, filling the room with white noise. Then he sat down at his desk, closed his eyes, and waited. The whisper came at midnight. Marcus. But this time something was different. The voice was fainter, struggling to be heard above the static. Marcus felt the presence behind him, felt it reaching for him, but the white noise was a barrier, a wall of sound that the listener couldn't penetrate. He spoke then for the first time since he had heard the whisper. I hear you, he said. But I don't acknowledge you. I give you nothing. No response, no fear, no recognition. You are nothing but sound, and I drown you in sound. The presence behind him flickered. He felt it struggling, trying to solidify, trying to become real enough to touch him. But the static was too loud, too constant. It filled every gap, every silence, leaving no space for the listener to exist. Marcus turned around. For one terrible moment he saw it. A shape made of absence, a void in the form of a man. It had no features, no face, nothing but emptiness where a body should have been. It reached for him with hands that were holes in the fabric of reality. And then it was gone. The static continued to hiss from the speakers. Marcus stood alone in his office, his heart racing, his hands shaking. But he was alive. The 3 days had passed and he was alive. He implemented the solution across Myrtle Ridge. Every home was fitted with speakers. Every room was filled with constant sound, whether it was music, radio static, or simply recordings of conversation. The town became the loudest place in the Appalachians, a cacophony of noise that never stopped. The killings ceased. But the listener was still there. Marcus knew it. On quiet nights, when the speakers briefly failed or the power flickered, he could feel it waiting. Patient. Eternal. Hungry. It would always be there, in the silence between heartbeats, in the pause between breaths. Waiting for someone to listen. Waiting for someone to answer. Marcus kept the bottle of bourbon in his desk, still unopened. And every night, before he went home, he turned on the radio and let the static fill the room. He never heard his name whispered again. But he never stopped listening for it. Epilogue. Final case summary. Myrtle Ridge serial killings. October, November 1987. Total victims, 8. Status, unsolved. Case closed, December 1, 1987. Filed by Sheriff Marcus Delaine. Note: subject to periodic review. Recommend maintaining current acoustic protocols indefinitely. Mary Catherine Oakes passed away in her sleep on November 22, 1987. She was the last person in Myrtle Ridge who knew the old rituals, the last guardian of knowledge that had protected the valley for 200 years. When they cleaned out her cottage, they found dozens of leather-bound books, all written in languages no one could read. The books were donated to the County Historical Society, where they remain to this day, their secrets locked away in ink and time. Sheriff Marcus Delaine served Myrtle Ridge for another 15 years before retiring in 2002. He never married, never had children, and never spoke publicly about what happened in the autumn of 1987. When he died in 2019, they found a single item in his bedside table, a tape recorder containing the last recording of Walter Brennan. The whisper on that tape had degraded over the years, becoming little more than static. But if you listen closely, very closely, you can still hear it. A name, spoken by nothing, waiting for an answer. The listener is patient. It has always been patient. And somewhere in a quiet room in a lonely house, it is whispering still.